Seems to me Jeff Bezos is the latest victim of climate change fraud. I believe he's offering $10 billion or going to donate $10 billion to fight climate change. And, all these people have great intentions. I do not question their intentions or their beliefs. But I do challenge the science behind their beliefs. Anyway, here's another Tony Eller video describing the data tampering that's going on at NASA and NOAA, which is incredibly shocking to me that, and this is under the Trump administration, who supposedly is draining the swamp. And, I mean, the swamp is as deep as ever when it comes to climate change fraud. Okay, here we go.
Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I frequently show NASA U.S. temperature graphs in 1999 and the present to show how the data has been altered. This graph was taken from the NASA website. It shows that in 1999 they listed 1934 as the hottest year and 1998 more than half a degree Celsius cooler. And they showed a 70-year-long cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. But in their current graphs of the same time period, they have reversed that trend. They now show warming after the 1930s, and they show 1998 warmer than 1934. I frequently hear climate alarmists call this conspiracy theory, but I took both graphs right off of the NASA website. Now I'm going to flash back and forth between the 1999 graph and the current graph. Now they show warming, but in 1999 they showed cooling. Now they show warming. This is the current NOAA U.S. maximum temperature graph for the past century. It shows that maximum temperatures in the United States have warmed more than 1 degree over the past century. But NOAA's raw data shows the opposite. It shows that maximum temperatures in the U.S. have cooled significantly over the past century. I've been pointing this out for over a decade, and every time a journalist picks up on it, there's a flurry of activity from Zeke Housefather and other climate alarmists. Zeke Housefather works at Berkeley Earth, and he's the go-to guy for PolitiFact and Snopes when they want to cover up climate fraud. Zeke said that I made 2 major errors in my analysis, which produced results showing a large bias due to infilling that doesn't really exist. I will read what Zeke wrote. First, he's simply averaging absolute temperatures rather than using anomalies. Absolute temperatures work fine if and only if the composition of the station network remains unchanged over time. If the composition does change, you'll often find that stations dropping out will result in climatological biases in the network due to differences in elevation and average temperatures that don't necessarily reflect any real information on month-to-month or year-to-year variability. And then Zeke said my second error was to not use any form of spatial weighting, e.g. gridding, when combining station records. While the United States Historical Climatology Network is fairly well distributed across the U.S., it's not perfectly so. And some areas of the country have considerably more stations than others. Night gridding can also exacerbate the effects of station dropout when the stations that drop out are not randomly distributed. So now we're going to test out Zeke's criticisms and see how important they actually are. But before I do that, I'm going to briefly discuss the fundamental problem with climate scientists who tamper with data. First thing to point out is that climate scientists are not data scientists, and they do not have the education or skills required to do this sort of work. Secondly, they have a severe conflict of interest. They have predicted warming, and they alter the data to produce warming where it doesn't exist. Climate scientists have no business being in control of the temperature data. Letting climate scientists control the temperature data is like having a Little League coach who also acts as umpire and scorekeeper. We would not put up with that in Little League, so why do we put up with it with matters that affect trillion-dollar policy decisions? Temperature data needs to be handled by independent third parties who have proper training in both data science and computer science. Now I'm going to show you why you don't tamper with the data. If Zeke is worried about changing station composition, the correct way to handle that is to use only a stable set of stations. There's about 690 stations in the United States which were active in both 1919 and 2019. The green dots on this map show that set of stable stations. This graph shows the average elevation of that group of stations over the past century. It's hardly changed at all, only about 20 feet up or down. And this graph shows the average latitude of that set of stations. Once again, it's hardly changed at all over the past century. And here's the average temperature graph for that group of stable stations. These stable stations show cooling very similar to the set of all stations. This tells us that changing station composition has minimal effect on the U.S. temperature record. If Zeke was a properly trained data scientist, he would have known that this was the correct way to analyze the data. What he should have been doing was testing the data rather than altering it. So I covered Zeke's first objection and showed that he's wrong. Now let's look at his second objection. Zeke says that the data needs to be gridded due to uneven spacing of stations around the country. You can see that the density of stations is higher in the eastern half of the country than it is in the western half. Now we're going to examine how significant an issue that is. The blue line in this graph shows NOAA NCDC gridded data, and the red line in the graph shows ungridded data, which I calculated. As you can see, there's hardly any difference between the two data sets. Gridding does almost nothing to the temperature trend. The gridded data in blue is slightly warmer, but the slope of the two trends are nearly identical. If Zeke was a data scientist, he would have known to do this experiment rather than altering the data. The cooling in the U.S. temperature record is very inconvenient for climate alarmists, so they're always looking for excuses to alter the data. The third standard excuse for data tampering, which Zeke didn't mention, is time of observation bias. NOAA believes that during the 1930s, most stations in the United States reset their thermometers during the afternoon, which caused double counting of hot days. So once again, they alter the data to compensate for their theory about afternoon temperature bias. And once again, it's the incorrect way to handle the problem. What they should have done was split up the stations into morning stations and afternoon stations and see how they compare. And that's exactly what I did. This is the set of all stations which NOAA believed reset their thermometers in the afternoon during July 1936. If there was a significant problem with time of observation bias, then the morning stations would show a warming trend and the afternoon stations would show a cooling trend. This is the graph for the set of afternoon stations. It shows a long-term cooling trend. Now let's look at the July 1936 morning stations. You can see that there's not as many of them, but they're fairly well distributed around the country. This is the graph for the set of morning stations. The trend is nearly identical to the afternoon stations, which tells us that time of observation bias is actually a very small effect. If time of observation bias was significant, this graph would have shown a warming trend rather than a cooling trend. On this graph, I plotted all four graphs: morning stations in red, all stations in pink, afternoon stations in green, and the stable set of stations from 1919 to 2019 in blue. Morning stations are warmer because they tend to be at lower latitudes where people are more likely to go out and look at the thermometer early in the morning. But the downwards trend for all four data sets is very similar. In this graph, I've normalized all four data sets to the year 1990. It shows that none of Zeke's claims really have much validity. If the data tampering did have validity, some of these trends would be going upwards rather than downwards. But all four of them are trending downwards, indicating that the basis for the data tampering is incorrect. On this graph, I added in the NOAA adjusted data in turquoise. You can see that the adjusted data shows warming and doesn't even remotely resemble any of the other graphs. These people are not doing science. They're not qualified to be doing these sort of adjustments, and they are committing fraud. Now we're going to look at what they're really doing with their data tampering. This graph shows the number of reporting stations over the past century. They peaked during the 1990s, but have dropped off precipitously over the past 20 years. There's nearly 400 missing stations now. But NOAA still makes up data for the missing stations. This graph shows the percent of data which NOAA is fabricating, meaning it didn't come from an actual thermometer. Currently, about half of the NOAA adjusted temperature data is fake. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that the NOAA adjusted data doesn't even vaguely resemble any of the actual data sets. I brought this problem to the attention of Anthony Watts and Judith Curry in 2014. Anthony Watts contacted Zeke and the people in charge at the National Climatic Data Center about what was going on, and they all acted shocked to learn that they were doing this. Anthony described the fake data as coming from zombie stations. And Anthony thought during the summer of 2014 that NCDC might have this fixed within a couple of weeks. But 6 years later, the problem has gotten much worse than it was in 2014. Zeke obviously knows about this problem because Anthony Watts told him about it. But Zeke continues to do his data tampering, and he continues to make up fake excuses for why they're doing it. This graph shows the amount of data tampering that's being done. The past is being cooled about 1.5 degrees, and the present is being warmed nearly 1 degree. That's more than 2 degrees of data tampering over the past century. This graph shows the same thing, only this time instead of plotting time across the x-axis, I've plotted atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And this graph shows us exactly what's going on. The data is being altered precisely to match their theory, the ultimate in junk science. As I mentioned earlier, climate scientists have no experience or training in data science, and they have no business working with this data set. The data needs to be handled by independent third-party professionals who are qualified to do this sort of analysis. The lack of training and skills, the conflicts of interest, and the huge amounts of money involved make climate scientists the very last people who should be touching the temperature data set. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.
Thank you for watching.